Welcome back to the Birdhouse Dynasty show, and today we're going to be talking about our early round avoids and late round targets in our upcoming redraft drafts, as well as taking this into play with how we could deal with these targets and avoids in our dynasty leagues. So, we're going to get you fired up right away with some early round avoids. And so, to do that, I want to share with you some of this here. Dive right in, show you Puka Nakua is my first man to discuss. Of course, Puka went down with a knee injury a couple days ago in training camp. Sean McVay is saying that everything should be fine and he should be ready to go week one. He's calling it a bursa sac injury. So I don't know exactly what the bursa sac is in the knee, but what I do know is that Sean McVay said that Cooper Kupp would be just fine for week one last year as well. So what I want to get into is the fact that where you have to draft Puka Nakua right now, currently, there are many other receivers in that similar range that do not have this kind of injury. And so that's why I would look at Puka as a definite avoid right now. Much rather have somebody like Garrett Wilson or Drake London, who's completely healthy as of right now. Neither of those guys are dealing with a wily veteran like Cooper Kupp as well. So Puka was already somebody I was kind of looking to avoid anyway and steer more towards Garrett Wilson or Drake London. There's other receivers in that range. I mean, in redraft, we're talking, let's see, when I set up the redraft board right now, there's probably a top 8 for me. And then after that, from the back end of the first round all the way to most of the second round, you can interchange a lot of those guys. I mean, you could go all the way from, say, Garrett Wilson down to even Ayuk and Debo Samuel, and you could interchange those guys any which way you want, and I wouldn't, be totally disgusted in your draft pick. So what I'm getting at is Puka is an injury liability right now out of the gate. And what I've learned over the last few years is guys who get hurt right before the season, I would prefer to just pass on them and take someone of a similar talent. Main point is that you can not win your draft in the first 4 or 5 rounds in redraft, but you can lose your draft. Last year, I took Cooper Kupp in the second round thinking I got a great deal. And what happened? I was playing from behind all season long. Even though I grabbed Tank Dell in that league later on, I was just playing behind the 8 ball. Didn't end up winning that league, took third. But, had I passed on Cooper Kupp and drafted somebody that was just simply healthy at the time, I definitely would have scored more points on the team. So it's just as simple as that. Puka right now is an avoid for me. Next up, I want to discuss one of his teammates, and that would be Kyren Williams. Now, Kyren Williams, Kyren Williams had a great breakout season in his second year last season. And, yes, McVay loves to pound the rock with one particular running back, and he's done it for years, going back to Todd Gurley. But they've had a different running back the last, 4 or 5 years in a row now, lead the team in rushing. And when they went ahead and drafted Blake Corum in the third round, that set up a huge alarm for me with Kyren Williams. I never was enamored with Kyren last season. Maybe it was because I didn't really own him in many leagues, so I wasn't overly ecstatic. I'm sure if you are a Kyren owner and had him last season, you love the guy and want to hang on to him and get every last bit out of him. But I can tell you from experience with someone like James Robinson that it's best to sell them when you can for sure get a first for them. All right. That's when we're talking dynasty. Now in redraft, Kyron's going in maybe the late second, early third round. And Personally, I just would rather if you're looking running back in the second round, I'd steer towards Saquon Barkley, or in the third round, maybe Travis Etienne. I don't love Etienne, but you know, Devon Achane would definitely be somebody that I would love to target over Kyron Williams. I just see the potential pitfall of Blake Corum waiting in the weeds there, just for any little Kyron Williams injury, for Corum to slide in and take over that backfield just scares me enough to avoid Kyron in the late second, early third rounds of your redraft leagues. Next up, I want to talk a couple guys that are generally going around the third round, and those two guys would be Devontae Adams and Sam Laporta. So starting with Devontae, we look at a Raiders offense that is going to be led by Gardner Minshew or perhaps Aiden O'Connell again. Now, I just don't see the firepower coming out of this offense there. Now, you can say the same thing for maybe Malik Neighbors in that he only has Daniel Jones running the show. But Daniel Jones, he has done it before. You got to remember that last year, Daniel Jones, he had just a ton of injuries. He started the season off, got hurt. Then when he came back, he tore his ACL like in the first quarter of that game. So it was just all downhill that season last year for Daniel Jones. Now he's coming back. Now he's got a top notch weapon. I would personally, in your redraft league, much rather have Neighbors than Devontae Adams. That's just me. I like the upside here. Devontae Adams, granted, the guy is a Hall of Famer, no doubt. I loved him in the Netflix series Receivers. It showed the heart that he plays with, that he's, not giving up, even though it's a rough situation. He's dealing with an entirely different organization than he was in Green Bay. One organization that is trying to rebuild, and he's trying to be part of that, and he wants to succeed. You can see it in his blood, it's there. But I just don't see the true upside for Devontae. If you're picking Devontae Adams, let's say as your wide receiver 2, even a wide receiver 3, if you want wide receiver the first 2 rounds. I mean, sure, it's a safe pick in the third round, but I'd rather take the upside of Neighbors. I think they both have the ability. There's other receivers there available in the third round. I just don't see the upside of Devontae Adams. When you're picking somebody that's early at the wide receiver position, I at least want, the upside of potentially getting double-digit touchdowns. And I just don't see that happening for Adams with the Raiders. Now, moving on to the next avoid I would have, and that would be Sam Laporta. So Laporta burst onto the scene last season and had a monster of a rookie season for tight ends. He's jumped all the way to tight end 1 in dynasty rankings. He's jumped all the way to the top of the boards in redrafts. And personally, I just don't see the discrepancy in points that are going to be scored by Laporta as much different versus other young tight ends like Dalton Kincaid or Trey McBride, as well as a couple of veterans like Kelsey and Andrews. If you want to slide those all together and jumble them into the top 5 tight ends this year in redraft, I would just be more than happy with whichever one of those is the 5th tight end off the board. You can give me Kincaid or Andrews all day long versus Laporta that got a draft two rounds earlier. So give me Kincaid or Andrews. I'll be more than happy with them. Either of them could easily end up outscoring Laporta for this year. Laporta's riding the 10 touchdowns that he caught last season. No other tight end had more than 6. So I would, you got to play the numbers game here. It's more than likely that those numbers come closer together or just simply reverse, and Laporta ends up with 6 touchdowns this year. Somebody else has 10 touchdowns, and that guy is the tight end 1. You know what I'm saying? So I just don't see buying a tight end in the third round as being good value this particular year. Like the player, just don't love the value right now. Next up on my avoids list early on in your drafts, I have Josh Jacobs. Now, I know that I've just taken Jacobs in a couple of underdog drafts and, suggested to somebody, one of my friends, to have Jacobs as one of his keepers. It's not that I hate Josh Jacobs. It's more so that I'm just a little leery of the Packers offense as a whole. Matt LaFleur has generally not just pounded one running back. Has not had a workhorse running back his whole tenure in Green Bay. He's, of course, had Aaron Jones at his disposal, and Aaron Jones typically is not a true workhorse back. He's excellent when he gets 15 to 18 touches a week, but he's never been a 20 plus touch guy. And also, you throw into the mix the fact that Jordan Love threw more than any other quarterback in the league inside the 10-yard line last year. And I'm just going to have to see it before I believe it that Josh Jacobs is just going to automatically get double digit touchdowns this season. So, could he do it? Very well, yes. But do I see top five upside at the running back position from Josh Jacobs? No, I just don't think that the volume is going to be there for Jacobs. I do think that he could have an excellent season. As you may know, the Packers did give him a 4-year deal. However, that 4-year deal is really broken down into 4 individual 1-year contracts. The Packers could easily get out from under the contract this next off season from Jacobs. So, what does that mean? Does that mean that they're just going to pound him to the ground this one season? Probably not. I mean, that's just not the Packers' MO. They're going to insert Marshawn Lloyd, the new rookie. He's going to get a chance as long as he hangs on to the ball, which he didn't do very well in college last season. But if he does hang on to the ball for LaFleur, I can see Marshawn Lloyd getting great opportunity early on. And then if there's a Jacobs injury, Lloyd would get increased work. You still have A.J. Dillon hanging around there. I don't know how much work Dillon's really going to get. He's been a huge fade for me. But Marshawn Lloyd's somebody that I'm gravitating more towards. Taking him late in redrafts. I got him in 1 or 2 dynasty leagues. So, like Marshawn Lloyd in the Packers backfield, don't hate Josh Jacobs. Just would steer more towards other options in the 4th, 5th round range. That's a range where I might look at, like I mentioned earlier with Laporta, that's where I might look at getting my first tight end or quarterback as opposed to taking Josh Jacobs. Generally speaking, I really only want to get one running back in the first 5 rounds. And if I'm doing that, I'm trying to do that more so in the 1st or 2nd round rather than in this sort of dead zone that you call the running back area of rounds 3 through 6. So Jacobs would be one that I would avoid. Next up on my avoid list early on in drafts would be Mr. Joe Burrow. Now, Burrow's awesome talent. Don't get me wrong here. However, that wrist injury that he incurred last season is still, in my mind, a lingering issue. No other quarterback has really incurred this kind of issue that Joe Burrow had. What it is it's an injury that typically happens to the wrist of offensive linemen when they get pushed back and they fall and they use their wrists to support their fall. What happened was one of the tendons in the wrist then separated. And so a quarterback has never had this type of injury as far as any kind of injury data, historically speaking, shows. So we don't know what the true recovery for this type of injury will be. What it does for a quarterback is it sort of hinders their ability to flick the ball. So like on the quick, like say you're doing a quick screen to the side for a Jamar Chase. I'm sure the Bengals will be planning on running that play this year, but we'll see if it actually, if it hinders Joe Burrow. I'd like to see not necessarily the 1st or 2nd quarter of the 1st week, but let's see what happens in the second half of the 1st game. Let's see a game. Maybe it's not till week 2 or 3 where, Burrow's forced to throw the ball 40 times because the Bengals are trailing. I'm just worried about this injury long term. So for Dynasty, yes, I have drafted Burrow. I know I got him in one league where I took Chase in the 1st round, got Burrow in the 2nd round. So I'm not totally off on Joe Burrow, but in redraft, there's so many options at the quarterback position. I would just pass on this potential landmine. When in the same range where Burrow goes, you can easily draft Kyler Murray, Anthony Richardson, um, maybe Jordan Love, Dak Prescott. There's just many other options who are going to who have similar ceilings to Burrow, and they don't have this wrist injury going on. So, next up on my avoids, and this is amidst all of the trade rumors going on, and this is, of course, Brandon Ayuk. So, I love Brandon Ayuk for what he pulled off last season for me in a couple of my leagues. He was one of those mid-range wide receivers that jumped up in value and finished back end wide receiver one, early wide receiver two numbers last season. So he was a big hit for many. Now he did this on the heels of great efficiency. He still only had, I think it was less than 110 targets last year and put up over 1,300 yards. Now, to expect a repeat performance of that is simply unrealistic, even if he stays in San Francisco. Now, if he gets moved somewhere and the main landing spots they're talking are just not great landing spots, we're talking Pittsburgh, Cleveland, New England, potentially, I don't know, Baltimore maybe, but Pittsburgh's definitely been the top on the list right now. They're saying that the Patriots are out of the mix. I forgot Washington is the other one, not necessarily Baltimore, but Washington. I wouldn't mind Washington. Problem there is you have a rookie quarterback, so I don't know how much passing volume actually will be there, especially with Jaden Daniels and his wheels that he has. He's going to tend to more so take off after his first read. Now, Brandon Ayuk would definitely be the top dog no matter where he goes, any of those four landing spots. But if we're talking Pittsburgh, I mean, there he's going, and he's going to be teaming up with George Pickens in an Arthur Smith offense that barely supported Drake London to get to the 30th ranked wide receiver last year. So I mean, you're going to see a huge. I just don't see the upside for Ayuk going to any of these places. Maybe in Dynasty and in years to come, he could develop something with, say, Drake May if he ended up there, or if he goes to Pittsburgh and Arthur Smith is one and done, and then they get a new offensive coordinator in there. But just look at the numbers of the top receivers in an Arthur Smith offense. I mean, only A.J. Brown has been able to produce viable fantasy starter numbers in an Arthur Smith offense, and that was through extreme efficiency there in Tennessee back in the days where Derrick Henry was pounding the ball all the time. So for Brandon Ayuk to benefit from a trade, he needs to be going somewhere else, not any of these places that they're talking about right now. So for me, Brandon Ayuk is just somebody that I am avoiding right now in redraft. Plenty of other options at wide receiver to pick from. You can just back off of Ayuk's price tag right now. And on the heels of that, I want to bring up George Pickens, because if Ayuk were to go to Pittsburgh, well, then George Pickens, my friends, is just not going to be a solid option. I don't think either of these guys, if it were to happen, this trade, I don't think either of these guys gets to 1,000 yards. Not in an offense where they're not going to throw the ball 500 times. You're going to have Russell Wilson or Justin Fields throwing them the ball. Now, Justin Fields was able to lead DJ Moore onto a great season last year, but that was a different offense. Arthur Smith is more geared towards the run. You're going to see great volume for Najee Harris, Jalen Warren, a lot of targets to the backfield, especially with Russell Wilson in there. He dumped off a lot last season. And so I just don't see it for Pickens right now. Again, there's so many options at the wide receiver position. You want to kind of to help yourself on draft day when you have so many options to choose from. It makes drafting a lot easier when you're able to just cross off a few names to start the draft with. And that way, when somebody like George Pickens is available and there's four other wide receivers very similar in profile, you can avoid George Pickens and just grab another one in that similar range. A couple of those guys I'll talk about in my targets for later rounds. And finally, we've got one injury update, and that's what I'm going to talk about here, and that's to Josh Downs. Josh Downs, of course, had a great profile his rookie season with the Indianapolis Colts, but now the Colts bringing uh, bringing A.D. Mitchell into the mix will definitely hurt his target share. You still have Michael Pittman as the top dog. And then, of course, you have Anthony Richardson, who's definitely going to run the ball some this year. So Josh Downs now getting hurt with an ankle injury that could miss a month. Again, this goes back to what I was talking about with Puka Nacua. So he has an ankle injury that could miss a month. What is that? It's probably a high ankle sprain, right? So it's a high ankle sprain. Those injuries tend to linger through the season. Yes, they come back and they're ready to go, but then it generally takes a couple weeks to fully heal. So if you're coming into the season already only at 80 or 90% compared to the other players who are starting at 100%, then you start playing a few games, you get banged up here and there. Well, Josh Downs probably is just never going to be at 100% all season long. So it's just not a sleeper wide receiver I want to be targeting anymore. I would rather target his counterpart, A.D. Mitchell. There's a ton of other wide receivers, especially a couple of these Charger wide receivers that I'll talk about in my targets that I would much rather have than Josh Downs right now. All right. So those are my avoids. Now let's get to the exciting ones, the guys that I do like drafting this year. So we'll start off again when I'm talking my targets. I want to target some sleepers that I'm talking about later in the draft. Early on in the draft, you want to get safe options. You're not going to win your league with some steal early on in the first round or second round, third, fourth, fifth round, even. Those are just guys that you want to make sure and hope they don't get injured and burn you. Later on, though, this is where you can take some chances. And up top, I've got J.K. Dobbins on the top of the list. Now, I'm going to be talking about all three Charger running backs, J.K. Dobbins, Gus Bus, and Kamani Vidal, because I think all three of them possess the potential to have a monster season. Any of these three dudes could end up with 10 plus touchdowns this year. Now, which one will it be? I don't know. Do you know? I don't think so. But I think that J.K. Dobbins will get the first crack at it. Now, if you look at J.K. Dobbins' numbers, he hasn't had a great season going back until you go back to his rookie season back in 2020, where he had 800 yards, finished as around the running back 21, 22 range, okay, and showed great potential going into his second season. But since then, unfortunately for Dobbins, he's undergone a myriad of different leg injuries, going from double torn. He had the ACL, MCL, everything shredded his knee. He's had ankle issues, all sorts of different injury issues. He had his Achilles torn last season, but now they're saying that Dobbins looks good. So you can use that. His price tag is super cheap, whether it's redraft or dynasty. He's worth a shot in the, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th round of your draft, depending on where he falls. I'm willing to take a shot on him. And if I don't get him, then I wouldn't mind taking a shot on the brand new rookie, Kamani Vidal. So most of you didn't hear about Kamani Vidal much last season in his last year in college. That's because he played for Troy, all right, which is a D2 school or 1AA. And he had a monster career there with Troy. He showed that he was a 3-down workhorse. He's built ready for the NFL, only 5'8", but 215 pounds, solid blocker. So he can play all 3 downs. If there's one guy out of these 3 that could replicate what Austin Eckler was for the Chargers the past few seasons, it would be Vidal. And we all know that Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman are going to try and pound the ball. But the fact is they have Justin Herbert at quarterback, and Herbert possesses much better arm talent than any other quarterback that Harbaugh and Greg Roman have had in their system, going back to the Niners days where they had Alex Smith and then Colin Kaepernick. Then you go to the days for Roman, at least in Baltimore with Lamar Jackson. None of those guys have the kind of arm talent that Justin Herbert has. So to just assume that because it's those two running the show, that the Chargers aren't going to throw the ball more than 500 times is pretty naive, in my opinion. First of all, you have to assume that the Chargers are going to have a top 5 defense in order to make them want to run the ball that much in the second half of games. I mean, if the Chargers are trailing by 20 points at halftime, you better believe that Herbert's going to be slinging it around the yard. Okay. And what that means is more targets for their wide receivers that I'll get into in a little bit. But what that also means is for their running backs, that somebody like Kamani Vidal could put up huge target numbers because we know that Justin Herbert likes to dump the ball off. He shows that with Austin Eckler the last few seasons. So we know that Herbert has the ability to dump off the ball. Now, that is a learned trait. Most rookies coming in to the NFL don't like to dump it off to the running back. They prefer to just take off and run. They're not as good at adapting to the speed of the game in the NFL. And so they're rather than going through all of their projections, they then just take off running. So that's what you'll see will happen probably with Jaden Daniels for sure. But more importantly, like Caleb Williams, I don't see Caleb Williams running backs getting as many targets as some might think either. He'll probably run a little bit more this first season than most would imagine. Now, getting into his second, third, fourth seasons, Caleb Williams might learn to dump off the ball better. But his rookie season, he probably won't. Now, going back to Herbert, though, Herbert has learned how to dump the ball off. He doesn't rely on his feet as much. So I could see Kamani Vidal demanding a nice, decent target share there, especially without any super alpha targets at wide receiver. So I see Vidal as the second best option. And then if you don't get either of those two, I would still not mind going with Gus Edwards. Now, Edwards, as we know from last season, did put up 800 yards and 13 touchdowns for the Ravens. Now, you can't just assume that he's going to replicate double-digit touchdowns now with the Chargers, especially with Dobbins and Vidal there in the backfield as well. So it's going to take an injury probably for Gus Bus to become fantasy relevant. But running back is where injuries happen. So if you can't get Dobbins or Vidal, I definitely don't mind dart throw on Gus Bus. Even at 29 years old, he's just a fine pick as your last pick in the draft. All right. Moving along outside of the Chargers backfield, we're going to jump over to another backfield, and that is the ambiguous backfield of the Dallas Cowboys. And right up top, we're going to start it off with Ezekiel Elliott. Zeke is one of my favorite buys this offseason. I've grabbed him in a couple of dynasty startups, grabbed him up off of waivers in a redraft that we already had. In fact, I dropped Javonte Williams for Zeke. I just see the Dallas offense as a strong offense, as definitely as opposed to the Denver offense. So I think that Zeke is in a position where he can literally just fall into the end zone at least 10 times this year. And just even if he simply averages 3.5 yards a carry, he'll get to 800 or more yards rushing. So add in a few receiving yards and you're looking at 1,000 yards, potentially 8 to 10 touchdowns from somebody you can grab in like the 12th round of your redraft. Sign me up for that. Okay. So I love Zeke going into his age 29 season. Yes, he's got some wear on the tread there, but it is Jerry World. Jerry loves Ezekiel Elliott. So I know he's going to weasel his way into working Zeke onto the field, at least to start the season, you can count on Zeke being the top dog in the backfield for the Cowboys. All right. Next up, I want to talk the Tennessee Titans. And so we've had an early season injury this offseason from DeAndre Hopkins. So we're talking Calvin Ridley now. Now, Ridley is supposed to be taking over the Jamar Chase role in the new Titans offense that Callahan is bringing in over from Cincinnati. And so the only difference is Will Levis is going to be at the helm. So what does that mean for the Titans? Well, really boils down to how well Will Levis can stay accurate. And last year, he was pretty accurate. He didn't have that many interceptions, considering he was just a rookie last year. So we'll see what the Tennessee passing volume actually is. I don't think that with Tony Pollard and Tajay Spears as your running backs, you're going to be looking to ground and pound that much. Both of those guys are receiving specialists in the backfield. So I think you could see a lot of pass attempts from this Tennessee offense, and their defense isn't bad, but when you factor into the equation the strength of that division, I mean, you've got the Houston Texans who made it to the semifinals in the AFC last year. You've got the up and coming Indianapolis Colts, and you got a talent stacked Jacksonville Jaguars in their division. I mean, it's easy to see the Titans as the fourth best team in that division. Now, I'm not putting it past them that they couldn't finish over 500 and squeak their way into the playoffs. But that would have to be on the back of a very strong season from Will Levis. Now, I, for one, am on the Will Levis bandwagon. So he's another target I have. But, back to Ridley, the Titans forked out a lot of money for Calvin Ridley. You better believe he's going to get targeted. So next up, like I was just talking about, is Mr. Will Levis. And so last year, Levis, see if I can bring up his stats here. So he didn't play. Where is his touchdown to interception ratio here? So Levis only had 4 interceptions. He had 6, 7, 8 touchdowns. 8 touchdowns to 4 interceptions. All right. Well, not terrible, especially for a rookie. And now with Calvin Ridley, Tyler Boyd, Chig Okonkwo, 2 good receiving running backs. And then whenever DeAndre Hopkins comes back, you have that kind of receiving core available at your disposal. You better believe Will Levis is on the hook this season. He may only be in his second year, but there's nothing putting the Titans past drafting another quarterback next year if Will Levis struggles this year. But that said, I like Will Levis's arm talent. I like what I saw from him last season. I know he only had 1 monster game, but I do like the Bengals' old offense as a good fit for this Titans mixture of talent that they brought in. And so I think that Will Levis is a great snag late in your redrafts as your backup quarterback. So he's a guy that is definitely worth gambling on. I just see the upside for him as being higher than somebody, say, like Russell Wilson or Daniel Jones, that you'd be drafting in that range. All right. Because the passing volume could be huge here in Tennessee. All right. Next up, want to get in going back to Dallas. One guy who I mentioned a little earlier when I was talking about Joe Burrow, and that is Dak Prescott. So as long as CD gets signed eventually, which I'm sure will happen, Dak is going into his last year with his contract for the Cowboys, and I'm sure he wouldn't mind finishing out his career in Dallas. But if Jerry isn't willing to pay him, teams will be lining up to bring Dak into town. So Dak finished in the top 3 in most leagues formats last season. Consistently undervalued, whether it's dynasty or redraft. I mean, Dak is going anywhere from quarterback, 8 to 10 right now. It's maybe 11th or 12th. And with the amount of passing volume that Mike McCarthy always shows year in, year out, there's no reason that Dak won't again be have another top 5 season. So I just see Dak as a great, safe option for you in round 7 or 8 or whatever in your redraft format. Again, I definitely would take him over Joe Burrow right now with Dak not having an injury, Burrow having an injury that he's going to have to deal with at some point this season. And so Dak is just a great, great find for you in redraft. Next up, another target I've got for you is at the quarterback position, and that would be Mr. Trevor Lawrence. Now, just take a look at the talent that they've assembled in Jacksonville around Lawrence. Yes, they lost Calvin Ridley, but they brought in Gabe Davis. They brought in Brian Thomas through the draft. They still have Christian Kirk there, still have Evan Ingram there. They still have the nice receiving threat of Travis Etienne out of the backfield. That's 5 great receiving options for Trevor Lawrence. I mean, just think about it. If you take Christian Kirk, Brian Thomas, Gabe Davis, and Evan Ingram, and all throw, say, 800 yards for all 4 of them, right? I don't know which one's going to be the top guy. I would bet on Christian Kirk, but I'm not betting on Christian Kirk going for 1,300, 1,400 yards. It's safe to say I don't know that any of these guys actually gets to 1,000 yards, but all 4 of them could get at least 800 yards. You're looking at 3,200 yards just with those 4 alone. Then you add in maybe another 400 yards from ETN, and you're sitting at 3,600 before you even get into any of the scrubs. So it's going to be real hard for Trevor Lawrence not to throw for 4,000 yards this season, barring any injury. So Trevor Lawrence, all off season has been falling down the board, falling. I still see him as a legitimate, you know, mid to late second round startup pick. Yet he's fallen into the 3rd, even 4th round in some startups. Some of that has to do with Caleb Williams and Jaden Daniels being in the mix now, but I see if I was taking him in redraft, I would take Lawrence over Caleb Williams. He's just a rookie. Lawrence has shown that he can play and play well at the NFL level. He just hasn't had that ultimate breakout season, but that could be this year. Every year, one quarterback comes out of nowhere, jumps up into the top 6 or 7 quarterbacks of the league. This could be Trevor Lawrence's season. All right, moving along. Couple more targets I've got late round for you. This comes off the heels of all the Brandon Ayuk news, and that would be Ricky Pearsall of the San Francisco 49ers. Rookie out of Florida, 6'3", 189. Now, he would definitely be the biggest beneficiary of a Brandon Ayuk trade. If he gets out of town, yes, Kittle will see a few more looks. Yes, Deebo Samuel would see a few more looks. But ultimately, Ricky Pearsall would go from somebody who's only going to probably see 50, 60 targets this season up to somebody who could get up to maybe 100 targets, right? The Niners generally don't have a huge amount of passing volume. They were one of the lowest passing volume teams, but they are extremely efficient with those targets. And that's because of the way Kyle Shanahan's able to maneuver his players around. Ricky Pearsall is a very unique chess piece that will get plenty of action. And so I think that Pearsall would be the number 1 beneficiary of a Brandon Ayuk deal. So Pearsall's worth a late round pick for me in redraft at this moment right now. Now, if we get a Brandon Ayuk mega contract signing later today or next week, then Pearsall would probably just drop off my board because he's somebody that I would just see as a roster clogger in that case. Next up is somebody I'd be targeting right now would be the Charger receivers. First off is Ladd McConkey, rookie out of Georgia. He's looking good in camp, great route runner, excellent athleticism. And to put it simply, somebody has to catch some of the targets that Justin Herbert is going to sling out there. Now, as I mentioned earlier, with Harbaugh and Greg Roman running the show, a lot of people think that the Chargers are going to drop down to the bottom 5 in passing volume. That's not necessarily the case. Again, you need a good defense in order to run the ball that much. All right. If the Chargers defense struggles, which as we've seen in the past, that's definitely been the case. They've been the biggest Jekyll and Hyde defense over the past 5 seasons that I can think of. And so if they can develop some consistency with all that talent they have on defense, then maybe you could be looking at a top 5 defense with the Chargers, and they'll be a top 5 rushing offense in the league. But if their defense struggles, and Herbert's got to be throwing the ball 40 times a game, then somebody like Ladd McConkey here will definitely benefit tremendously and definitely outperform his draft value right now. McConkey's somebody you can get as your whatever 5th receiver right now, going in round 10 or so of your redraft leagues. I still see his teammate, that would be Josh Palmer, as the better value. Palmer's somebody who has performed excellently for the Chargers over the past couple of seasons. Whenever Keenan Allen or Mike Williams has been injured, Josh Palmer has stepped up his game. So the familiarity that he has with Justin Herbert makes me want Josh Palmer slightly more than Ladd McConkey right now. And that's mostly because Palmer is going a round or 2 later than McConkey. So I would rather pass on McConkey and grab Josh Palmer. But if you just want to go for the rookie and the potential upside there, I can understand that as well. But Palmer would be my main target. So that's all I've got for you guys today. Jump on those Chargers players late in your drafts, and you should be rewarded with 1 or 2 of those guys. Avoid those injury-riddled landmines early on in your draft, and that should help you develop some great success this 2024 season. That's all I've got. Peace. I'm out.